Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a great discussion about humanity's last exam. A very exciting eval and benchmark set up by Scale and the research team at Scale and the Center for AI Safety. So we're going to have a really great discussion today. I have with me Summer Yu, who's the Director of Research here at Scale and leads our Gen AI research team, and Dan Hendrycks, who is the head of the Center for AI Safety. So thank you to Summer and Dan, and I'm really excited to talk today.
Great to be here.
Great, so let's kick things off talking about Scale and the work that you do on Gen AI research, Summer. Can you give a brief overview of Scale's research initiatives and the work that you do with SEAL and the SEAL leaderboard?
Yeah, certainly. So many people know Scale as the data company. So Scale, where we supply the data for a lot of these frontier model builders to build their models. But many people don't know we actually have a lot of research around here, and our focus is really at the intersection of data and model building. So if I were to categorize it in three big categories, the first one is around the science of data in post-training. So we are studying what kind of data would actually help your model climb, and maybe even before that you actually train the model on this data. Can we predict that if the data will be useful? And the second piece is around the more frontier domains like agentic use cases, the super popular ones nowadays like reasoning, RL reasoning data. And we study how to design the environments and the data structure such that you're able to train models and help them climb in that way. And the third one is more relevant to today's conversation, is around the SEAL leaderboards. This is from our internal lab called SEAL, with a focus on safety, alignment, and evaluations. So in the SEAL leaderboards, we actually publish a lot of industry leaderboards around things like instruction following, reasoning, like frontier areas that people care a lot about. And then humanity's last exam also shows up in the SEAL leaderboard as a frontier reasoning benchmark. So happy to talk more about that.
Great, yeah, we're going to talk a lot today about frontier areas, and reasoning I think is a very hot topic, so excited to bring that up. Dan, let's go to you. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in this area? I know you've done a lot of work on things like activation functions across all of AI. How did you get started building Center for AI Safety?
Yeah, I focused on safety from the beginning of my career, largely because I think that AI will be a big deal and people aren't thinking much about its consequences or implications. It's very difficult to wrap your head around. So it seemed useful to dedicate myself to trying to get on top of some of the downside implications, or just try and help people understand what's going on in AI better. So that's why I got into safety. AI is a big deal, and some people need to think about what could go wrong. And that's why I started the center, and I've been working on evaluations and benchmarks largely because I think a basic bit of information is like, how good are the models? What's their rate of improvement? Where are they headed? What can they do? What can't they do? That's important for anybody being oriented, and it looks like that's a difficult problem that happened to work well with my skill set. So I've been making evaluations and benchmarks since maybe like 2016 or so. I mean, obviously before this there were some evaluations like MMLU and math, and before that, pre-ChatGPT, there are vision ones like ImageNet-C and others. So happy to keep continuing trying to help people understand the rate of improvement of AI and how far we are away from certain targets. Yeah.
Perfect. Summer, you mentioned some of your work on frontier capabilities, and actually recently SEAL published new leaderboards on frontier capabilities like vision understanding. There's a Vista leaderboard that you published, multi-challenge, which evaluates how LLMs perform on long multi-turn conversations. Can you talk a little bit about your vision for frontier leaderboards?
Maybe I can start with a bit of a history here on how SEAL got started. In 2024, I was actually I just joined Scale at the time. I was working as a researcher at Google DeepMind, focused on the Gemini models. And something I realized is that there isn't a great way to really assess the capabilities of the models we have, how it compares with the other labs. And we have all these amazing benchmarks that Dan has built here, but the big issue with that is because it's so public and everyone has access to it. Sometimes there's maybe unintentional contamination, where if you have trained a model to like crawl the internet, right, it might have this benchmark already in part of the training corpus, and people aren't sure if that fully reflects the actual capabilities of the model when you evaluate on these. So another super popular platform at the time is called LMSys Chatbot Arena, and this is a really cool idea where these folks at Berkeley, they built this platform where the whole community can come to this platform and they can rank models side by side, say this is better and this is not better. The issue with that, this is a great initiative, but it's not very actionable if you think about it. At the time, I see, okay, like Gemini is like number 4 on the leaderboard, but what does that mean, right? People kind of like it, and then what do I actually do with this information? So a key thing that we're trying to do here at the SEAL leaderboards is to create something that's actually actionable. Like we'll tell you you're ranking number 3, number 4 on the leaderboard, and what does that actually mean? What are the areas that we're testing it against, and how do you go about improving it? So in order to do this, we are super transparent about the type of evals that we run. We're very transparent in actually listing out the specific questions that we ask the people who are doing the evaluations. And then we report on not just like the full ranking, but also just dimensionally, right? Instruction following for your coding leaderboard, what is it in this dimension? What about the correctness? What about the code readability? And people can dive into specific areas on how they can improve. So that was kind of the idea in 2024. I think moving forward to like end of 2024, 2025, we noticed that a lot of the leaderboards that we had set out in building earlier, models are doing really well on those already. Right? So we know that there's a ton of model improvements, a lot of progress over 2024. So in 2025, we're actually focusing on areas that we think are very at the frontier, where most models are scoring pretty badly on the leaderboard.
Yeah.
So one of the launch criteria for the future leaderboards we have, including the past few, like including Vista, multi-challenge, the ones you mentioned, we're building only benchmarks that the models are scoring badly in. So maybe like by the end of the year, they will do a lot better, but that's the point of tracking progress.
Great. Yeah, I definitely want to ask more about that when a benchmark becomes saturated, what the consequences are. Dan, you've been known in publishing many, many important benchmarks over the years in areas of factuality, multimodal understanding. What inspired you to build this collaboration between Scale and CIS and develop Humanities last exam?
Yeah, I mean, we had earlier worked on some benchmarks like WMDP, which was measuring what's models' understanding of dual use domains like virology and chemistry for chemical weapons and things like that. And so that went really well. And then I was sort of noticing that it was quite difficult to create data sets that models couldn't get expert level at in many ways for some types of questions. So it seemed to me that people had a few difficult questions in them, but trying to get experts to give you 1,000 difficult questions to make a full data set, that was seeming to be really difficult. So this made me think that it's not about having 2 or 3 experts making a data set. Now we're probably needing more like a collection, a collective of people to work together to try and make these data sets. And of course, then Scale is skilled at that. I am not. They have all the experience in figuring out how to pull people together to create data sets, and so it just seemed natural from prior collaborations and this one's to going forward just do more projects together, including Humanities Last Exam, since there's a lot of complementary skills and aligned incentives.
Yeah. Great. Given that there's lots of benchmarks out there right now, and every new model release, we see an interesting subset of benchmarks chosen as part of their papers. What really distinguishes Humanities Last Exam from other benchmarks that you might be using?
I think with Humanities Last Exam, it's sort of designed too, where it gets the name is that when models are really good at it, I think that basically is evidence that the genre of asking AI systems closed-ended questions and big sets of closed-ended questions for which the answer is already known comes to an end. Like, it's not as interesting. There might be a few narrow, small domains where there's still a few types of questions, but we then have something really, really quite substantial. That isn't to say it's capable at everything, but this would be in some ways an indication of whether we have AIs that are like oracles in some way. Can they tell you answers to known things really well, like an expert at an expert level or a world-class level? I think the construction process itself is quite different from other benchmarks, where people primarily enlist just a few experts and have them generate a lot of questions, and then that's the data set. The difficulty needed to challenge these AI systems is getting harder, where you're needing to put together groups. For instance, very recently had Enigma eval come out, Scale put that out, and that also had the property that groups of people have to come together in some way, either in the creation or in the solving process for the questions. So I think that the difficulty is, and the generating process is just quite unlike other sorts of data sets, and so that should probably be a good indicator of world-class ability of answering closed-ended sorts of questions.
Yeah. Summer, same question to you. You've worked on a variety of different benchmarks at this point. What really distinguishes Humanities Last Exam for you?
Yeah, I think I would second everything Dan is saying, right? Humanities Last Exam is created very differently. We're asking experts who are top of their field to generate these like super, super difficult questions. We have like our existing benchmarks. Some are, I think like GSM-AK is like grade school level. We have some graduate level questions, but no existing benchmark has been as difficult as the one we have here.
That's great. Great. Scale in our work often works with frontier AI labs and model providers, training the future of these models, particularly using reinforcement learning, other techniques in post-training. How do you and Scale maintain neutrality when you're working on evaluating the same model providers that maybe we're working with on post-training?
Yeah, this is a extremely good question, and then I actually do get this question a lot because Scale, we do supply data to a lot of our partner frontier model builders. We work with, honestly, like a lot of them, almost all of them, and then to be in this role as well as a neutral evaluator sounds like there would be some sort of like conflict of interest, and that's something actually when we started out Scale, we took this extremely seriously. So within organizationally within Scale is kind of like a separate arm and fully separated from our commercial arm that's supplying data. When we're designing these Scale leaderboards, like the methodology, the processes, there's like a wall between what these documentations are and then the people who, on the commercial side, they actually don't have access to this. We're also doing a lot, like going above and beyond in showing the world that we're super transparent, and if there's any potential for like conflict of interest, we proactively flag it. So one thing that we do with the leaderboards is that we believe that if we ever have sent the prompts in the eval set to the model builder in some ways, oftentimes when we first evaluate it, put them on the leaderboard, if you're, say, like a model builder that allows API access, technically, right, we don't think people do that because there's like a ton of prompts that enter their APIs. But technically, if they really want to, they can log the evaluation prompts that we have, and they can train on it, technically. But so what we do is whenever we're evaluating the next generation of the model from the same company, we actually proactively disclose that, we suspect that this company might already have the prompt. So community, like, please take this with a grain of salt. For all the leaderboards, we make sure that if we ever send the prompts to the model builders, we grade out, we tell the community this is exactly what happened, and every few months we actually refresh the leaderboard so that you can imagine if we push out the leaderboard and then everything is grayed out, it doesn't make sense. So we refresh it, and then we make sure that they're up to date.
Great. That's great. Dan, if there's anything I know about benchmarks, is that they can be very hard to design effectively. What were the main limitations you had to operate under when you were designing Humanities Last Exam, or important constraints that you were considering?
I think the main difficulties come from just selecting the right premise for the paper in the first place. There's a lot of phenomena you can measure, a lot that you can zoom into, but as we've been seeing for benchmarks, there are only a few that people actually end up using. So while people can create many hundreds of them, maybe 10 or 5 will actually be relevant. So it's important to get the basic idea correct. And I think once the premise was fleshed out that this will be a group of people coming together, in some ways crowdsourced, to create the benchmark, and then there'll be an academic incentive of publication, and of course also a pecuniary incentive. That seemed like the premise was there. It's kind of like in making a movie, like, oh, you've heard the pitch for the movie, and you go, oh, that would be something I'd like to watch. And then from there, it's kind of filling in the details, which isn't to trivialize it, because that's 90% of the work. Just as you can, write an interesting plot scenario or something like that on a napkin, but that's quite different from actually production, and it's a totally different ball game that requires special skills and very, very easy to mess up as well. I think there are generally a lot of opportunities in making benchmarks or hazards to avoid. A lot of very simple things could totally ruin the effectiveness of it. For instance, if we included a lot of audio, or if we included any audio examples, that would possibly make this a lot harder, because a lot of the models do not accept that yet. These types of questions, what are the standards for whether they're to be included or excluded? There's having an eye toward where the models will be in a year's time and making sure it would measure those sorts of advancements fairly well. So I think a fair amount of it is sort of figuring out where the hockey puck is going to be and skating toward that. So one needs to do a little bit of forward prediction to make sure that one isn't measuring a property that just isn't that relevant or doesn't track the interesting phenomena as the models evolve. Once there was the idea, still, it was a crazy amount of work. I mean, I think this project, I don't remember exactly how long this took, but maybe like half a year plus or so. But so I think people will just trivialize it, and then you just collect the data, and it's like, that is very easy to mess up. I think people greatly underestimate the difficulty of executing things well, and it shows. For instance, one data set I made in the past, I think that the apps data set, it was just a lot noisier, and it took so much time, but I couldn't get it to be like extremely, the evaluation to be extremely clean and pure. And I think it showed in terms of its overall impact, because it was just, there's so many sources that we used for it. This was a coding benchmark then, but there's so many sources we used for it, and so many corner cases and complications. There's just months and months of cleaning, and still it wasn't good enough. So it's kind of like if you have a somewhat bad premise for a data set or bad path for creating it, then it's kind of like you're shooting a movie and the script isn't quite there, and so what you're doing is you're locally putting out fires, and it's kind of just a mess for several months because you didn't optimize the basic premise and some of the high level variables appropriately, and then you're mired in complications and corner cases for months, and maybe you don't actually escape from it, and the overall quality isn't that good. So.
Yeah. Makes sense. Great. So fast forwarding to the release of Humanity's Last Exam, and everything you said about openness and transparentness, you released about 2,700 of these questions and answers as part of the release of the leaderboard and the exam itself. Right after these questions came out, there were some questions about the quality of some of the questions that were included in that data set, and the effects that maybe individual questions had on model scores. Do either of you care to comment on how those sort of concerns came about and how you're addressing them?
Yeah, so I think for HLE, there was trying to measure some capabilities that aren't there yet in the models, but that would include things that aren't necessarily the most academically tricky. For instance, there'd be like some obscure Dungeons and Dragons type of rule thing that is complicated and difficult for people to answer. So I sort of was like, yeah, let's include that because that's difficult. it is difficult. But it didn't have the sort of academic stodgy type of feel of just a pure raw difficult mathematics question. So I think generally a design principle I like to include in these multifaceted benchmarks is to try to zoom into a lot of or include a long tail of different phenomena for additional robustness. And that will include testing some different skills compared to it being a 100% mathematics exam. I want to see if its reasoning skills and its research skills and its knowledge can cover other things like ecology or law or classics, etc. So I think some people wanted it just to be raw physics and math or solely, but I didn't think that was. I think for the robustness of it and it being representative and making sure that we have good coverage and that it's in keeping with the title of the data set, that it should be inclusive of pretty much most things. I should say, as well as in the construction process, since we kept it open to whatever's tough for the models, roughly speaking, then we were seeing other interesting types of questions. So some people would submit things like puzzles and whatnot, which partly gave an idea of, this distribution of puzzles in particular, or these enigmatic type of questions where you have to figure out a sequence of characters that makes the whole thing make sense. That partially inspired the Enigma eval that we put out earlier as well. So it reminds me of when constructing MMLU, we noticed that a difficult subset of questions were the mathematics questions, and that caused us then to make the math data set. And so I think likewise in HLE, there's a difficult subset of questions of puzzles, and that partly led us to go down making the Enigma evaluation as well.
Yeah.
It has a lot of breadth. That's a deliberate choice, though.
Yeah. Summer, you've also spent a lot of time thinking about better quality evaluations. Did some of this feedback about specific questions help inform how you think about HLE and the process going forward?
Yeah, so speaking of quality, I think if we talk with researchers in these model building labs, and I was one of them before, and then if you don't really think about it, you assume that like these eval sets out there, they're like 100% accurate. Everything is 100% accurate, and if I spot one error, it's like a bad eval set. The reality is that that's just simply not the case, right? Humans are pretty flawed. Like Dan was saying, like the process of constructing an eval set, a data set, is really difficult. Like in HLE, we had around 70,000 plus submissions, and then in the eval set, we only had around 3,000 questions that were considered like good questions. We have done, some amount of quality filtering to make sure that the questions are sound. Honestly, it's like a lighter filtering process compared to what Scale normally does for our commercial engagements, because it's more of a research project. And also just the fact that the accuracy here on the benchmark, imagine even if you have like a 10% error rate, I'm making up the number as an example, right? If you have a 10% error rate, if the questions themselves are just wrong, what it impacts is the accuracy, like the best model could possibly get on it. So it will usually be 100%, and now it's like 90%. But when we are presenting the leaderboard, because most of the models are at like single-digit percentage, so it still tells the same story that the models are not good enough for this eval set yet. And yeah, we recognize it's definitely not a data set that's 100% correctness rate, but we do internal evaluations and auditing on the data set, and we have a number on the rough error rate, and it's on par with a lot of the open benchmarks out there. We're doing even more on launching this bounty program to ask the community to come to us, right, submit, if you spot an error in the data set, tell us and we'll fix the data set, and over time we're striving to get to 100% accurate.
Back to the construction of these questions, you mentioned these are close-ended questions by intention, which would be as opposed to more open-ended questions that test creativity or nuance or certain problem-solving capabilities that are harder to do with a closed-ended question. What are the advantages or disadvantages of choosing the closed-ended model?
Yeah, I mean, I think closed-ended, even for closed-ended mathematics questions, they still might require things like creativity and problem solving. But the open-ended ones, though, tend to have an issue where you don't have an automatic evaluation. So I think that that's important. There are multiple dimensions to measure. So HLE isn't the last evaluation entirely. There are other ones to do. For instance, to measure their ability to complete open-ended sorts of tasks. But this is measuring just an important part of their skills. So I think open-endedness has a subjectivity. It reduces the automatic evaluation ability. Another issue is that the agent paradigm of having AIs go off and do tasks like book you flights and things like that, or make you PowerPoints, that is important to measure. The paradigm for that at the time of construction and even now wasn't particularly articulated or converged on yet, and this makes it very difficult to have confidence in an agent evaluation. There have been many attempts. Yeah. But for all that, there's still a lot of creative destruction. And so if one's trying to make a benchmark that will stand the test of time in AI years, that is to say, if one's trying to do that, you usually need a little bit more of a line of sight as to what the phenomena will look like as the paradigm is scaled up. So since it hasn't converged, haven't been doing as much on open-ended questions. We're still looking into it. I think that there are some ways to de-risk the design so that it doesn't measure something irrelevant or assume a wrong paradigm. But it made sense to, in the genre of closed source, take that to its conclusion, to its extreme through the collection process. But there'll certainly be additional challenges when we're considering tasks, open-ended questions, things that are matters of taste, other sorts of challenges beyond closed-ended questions.
Great. Summer, since we're talking about humanities last exam, let's talk about the role of humans in building this exam. So in recent SEAL leaderboards, you've talked about the role that human expertise plays in benchmark design and eval construction. Do you foresee a shift now where human expertise plays a role in benchmark design? We rely a lot upon LLMs as a judge in the actual evaluation process.
Yeah, so I think with humanities last exam, we had a lot of human efforts in actually curating this giant data set. And Scale, right, we personally have, not personally, but Scale as a company, we had paid out $500,000 to encourage these contributors to the data set. And these are human experts all over the world. So this is saying that, yes, there's a huge part that human experts and human expertise is needed in the benchmark construction process. Back to the earlier part of the question, like whether we are seeing a shift from just like fully human evaluations where the human creates the eval but also does the evaluation whenever a model comes out, compared to the human experts design and craft the eval, and you leverage large language models or like language model as a judge to help do the evaluation pieces down the line. I think the answer is yes. Like we're seeing a shift that there's a lot of new evals that we are building, even at the SEAL leaderboard. The new ones, the Vista, multi-challenge, a lot of the new ones are the humans craft the evaluation process, and then the language model actually does the evals later on. And the advantage of this is it's a lot faster. Human, if you do ask 3,000 questions and then you want human judgment, it would take much longer than if you just run it through the model. But the key piece here is that when you design the eval itself to enable a future large language model to do the eval, like the design becomes more complex. Yeah. You're not just giving the questions and the answers. You're oftentimes, if there isn't a ground truth answer, you want the people, the experts to come up with a list of rubrics of like what counts as good, what counts as bad. And some of those are like very involved. There could be like 20 or even more criteria to evaluate the response on. And also, like moving forward, as the language models are doing the eval process, we also want to ensure that ongoing, like there is a good correlation between that and human judgment. We might not need to do the human eval on the entire data set, but periodically we should check for alignment between humans and the language model.
Yeah. Can you expand upon that? What are the things that can go wrong if there isn't a good correlation between the human?
Yeah, so one classic example here is it's a well-known bias that language models have when you ask them which answer do you prefer, they generally prefer the answer that they themselves give. If you ask, say like, Claude to rank like the OpenAI model and the Gemini model and Claude says, of course, like my answer is the best. But if you ask like a different model, it would say their answer is the best. So that's an example where you want to make sure that you're not injecting these biases without intending to. Also, as we're building harder and harder evaluations, we're by definition testing the areas that's out of scope, like that's hard for the language models. Mm-hmm. So it's hard for them to generate the correct answer. It's also harder for them to make the correct evaluation prediction. So for all these benchmarks that we are doing kind of a hybrid method of eval design, where we have like human crafted methodology and then language model as an eval, mm-hmm. we report on the alignment rate between the humans and language models, and almost all of them have like 90% plus alignment rate, and that's how we feel confident that we trust the results.
Yeah, that's great. Dan, as part of the paper release, you also reported on the calibration error of each of the models that you were evaluating. And despite the fact that almost all the models had single-digit accuracy and so probably should have had low confidence in their answers, the calibration error was very high for each of these models. What should we interpret from that? And can you explain the role of calibration?
They're very overconfident, even when they're dramatically wrong most of the time. So that's not good. I think that you sort of get what you measure, and the AI community hasn't really been paying as close attention to calibration. So hopefully HLE, since we are emphasizing calibration, this will encourage people to make the models more calibrated. This is important because of things like hallucinations. Everybody knows that's a problem. How can we get the AI systems to know what they don't know? And I think that calibration is a good way of measuring that. I don't know of any really great, extremely popular hallucination evaluations, but I think that this, by measuring the calibration error on HLE, can serve something like that purpose for some time. This is also important because now the AI systems are starting to get quite a bit smarter than a lot of its users in these domains. Mm-hmm. And so it needs to appropriately express its confidence. It can't be saying, oh yeah, this is totally the answer every single time. This wasn't as much of a problem historically when AI systems were being tested on common sense answering questions, like does butter melt, or is this flammable, or these sorts of things. There, people can easily check whether the answer is correct or not. So it doesn't provide that much information, its confidence or even its answer, because it was so beneath human intellectual abilities. Yeah. But now, since they're beyond, we don't really have much more signal beyond, except for its rationale and the confidence it assigns with it. So we want that to be a very trustworthy number. Yeah. So I think you basically get two things in one. You do get a sort of STEM or theoretical part of the academy automation indicator through HLE, but you also get a hallucination benchmark by looking at the calibration error. So I think you can have two purposes, and hopefully both of those will increase its usefulness.
Yeah. Do you think there are consequences to future human oversight of these models, seeing this calibration error be so high on frontier questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think basically they're not trustworthy whatsoever for that. They may be very well calibrated on simple questions, like common sense type of questions. They'll just say, they'll answer them correctly and they'll say 100%, and yep, you're right. But now we're seeing on just difficult distributions, they tend to do a bad job. This is probably a resolvable problem in computer vision. Under extreme distribution shifts, it was possible to calibrate these models with good techniques. So hopefully the same will be possible with LLMs, and they'll appropriately express their confidence and have it reflect the underlying reality of their accuracy.
Yeah. And with the release of the HLE paper and the hierarchy of which models performed well, it seemed like reasoning models were actually performing a little bit better than most of the other models, which includes OpenAI's O3 Mini, DeepSeek's R1. And now, since then, OpenAI has released a reasoning plus search model, Deep Research, that they claim gets a high watermark on this eval. What do you think the consequences are of reasoning models performing well, or do you think there's something unique about reasoning that makes these models perform well?
Oh yeah. I think the reasoning paradigm is probably what will take you to very high performance on this benchmark. I think that O3 coming out the results on the O3 deep research model being shared was not an indication that it just took a week to do really high. This was a sort of latent background thing, just where the number wasn't reported on this data set. But people should expect the number to be going up, I think, fairly rapidly. That's not an indication of the data set being easy. I'd encourage people to try and answer some of the questions themselves if they think that's the case. But instead, that the reasoning paradigm shows some really substantial progress. So I think we'll see how the next class of reasoning models will be out. We'll see what the actual O3 model will be, the publicly available queryable one compared to one that takes a long time to answer, and what other sort of models are being offered out there. But I think it's it's such an interesting space, and I expect a lot of movement.
Summer, knowing that these reasoning models seem to have at least a slight advantage on HLE, when do we expect to see O3 Pro and other models added? And do you expect to see more search models added to the eval, or to the leaderboard? Sorry.
Yeah. Short answer is yes. Right? When there's a new model, we believe will do really well on the benchmark. We're going to add it to the leaderboard so that the whole community understands where we are. I think with the search-enabled models, one potential problematic piece is that HLE is not open source, and they can actually search and in theory just find the correct answer if they try, if someone posts the correct answers. I think we actually do post the correct answers as part of the data set. So I think that we probably want to take that into account. If it's a search model, it's actually looking at the page, then it might not accurately reflect the performance.
Right.
Well, that's why there's a private set though too, so that can be mitigated. But yeah.
That's true. That's why we have a fully withheld private set. In say a year, when people are doing a lot better on this public set, we can go back and check how much of this is from maybe overfitting, from searching the loop, or if it's from actual model improvements.
Great. That's great. Any considerations you have in improving the benchmark design, whether grading partially correct solutions or better rubrics maybe for certain questions?
No, I think it's sort of like there's the movie's been made or something like that. Or kind of like let's think like a song or something. It's like, well, if you adjust lots of or some parts of it, then usually those changes have to cascade because there's a dependency structure, and so I think it's difficult to try and tinker with the design of these sort of after the fact. There's sort of some core ideas, and they have to complement each other and work together. And usually, hopefully, we will have had the main improvements to the ideas done very early on in the process and not prior to collections. But the very local minor changes would be largely coming through the bounty program, where we can throw out questions that people identify to be incorrect. Yeah. But as far as core ideas, I think I probably wouldn't do that differently.
Yeah. Now that OpenAI has reported that deep research scored 26.6%, which is a new high watermark on humanities last exam, when do you think we'll have a model that hits 50% or even 90%? And when will this benchmark become saturated? And feel free to take a guess or an informed prediction about when that'll happen.
Yeah, I think a lot of the performance comes from the O3 model being better at mathematics than the O1 model or O3 mini model. So I think that because O3 mini, for instance, is getting maybe around 10%. So I'd expect the numbers to keep going up, of course. The time at which we might get to 50%, in the paper we mentioned that maybe the models, or it's very plausible that the models would get over 50% by the end of the year. As in, if people were to say, no, they will not get 50% and with high confidence or higher, I think that's a strong claim, just because the rate of improvement behind the scenes is so rapid. And it seems plausible to me that we'd get something like a superhuman mathematician this year. Maybe not. I mean, well, let's see how it is in competitive programming, for instance. We're seeing now that it's maybe there's a handful of people in the United States who are better at competitive programming than the latest models, and they'll probably be better than all the competitive programmers by end of year. And maybe in mathematics that will have a similar fate. So given that it's really tough to rule out that it couldn't be something like a superhuman mathematician in the next year or so, then as a consequence, we might expect fairly high performance on humanity's last exam as well.
Yeah. Summer, given that us at Scale sometimes say we're the data foundry for AGI, do the pending release of models that will score over 50% of humanity's last exam, does it change how you think about AGI or artificial superintelligence and what the nuances are there?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of components to be able to call something an AGI. I think just being really good at solving math problems, being good at these reasoning, depending on your definition. In my definition, I don't think that's actually what AGI means. Right? When we think more about AGI, we think about maybe doing more practical things, maybe giving them your job, being your good virtual assistant, and acting as good as your human virtual assistant can be, and extending that to a lot of other jobs. And maybe, Dan, you want to talk about a preview of something we're cooking?
Very briefly, I guess. Yeah, there'd be other things that would make it be thought a more general intelligence, something with more economic impact. So to your point about what about open-ended questions or open-ended tasks, we're collecting data to try and get at that and see what the actual economic impacts of AIs might be. I think in the future of benchmarking, we're seeing with HLE it's reasoning and knowledge, the human frontiers for things in the academy, like the peak of intellectual abilities, but that's different from their practical abilities and their know-how, which really matter. A lot of people who are extremely impactful in the economy, they're not necessarily the smartest. That's fine. That's still useful. And in fact, they're often more useful than the very smartest people. I think it's important to measure some of these other sorts of skills, and we intend to measure those through its agential skills, through its ability to actually accomplish tasks. But if we have that and HLE being really high, that would seem like something like a digital type of AGI. It's not AGI in the way that it can fold your laundry or something, or even necessarily drive your car. Yeah. But
DAGI, can I call it digital AGI?
Yeah, sure, something like that. Something that deals with digital labor or stuff that can be done through things amenable to remote work. And I think that would be quite important. But I generally don't use the sort of AGI distinction because it makes it sound like there's a big monolithic thing to bump into, and the intelligence frontier is very jagged. They're good at some things, terrible at others, and that will probably continue to be the case. But insofar as it's a shorthand for is it economically impactful and relevant and potentially disruptive to labor markets, then yeah, I think HLE wouldn't necessarily do that. That might just have implications for the academy and a lot of the theoretical parts of science. But later work, I think, would be more directly measuring its impacts for labor.
Great. And to chime in here a little more on the AGI topic, my personal view here is we're not going to go from where we are now with like 10%, 26% on HLE to just full virtual AGI as we're talking about. Right? There's going to be a period of time where you have a very competent AI agent that's trying to do some of the economically valuable work in the virtual world. And there will be some version of human supervision, like a human that's looking at it and ensuring that it's doing the right thing. Maybe it's like automating 80% of what the human can do, but still there's going to be the 20% where the human comes in and review the work. And I think that's going back to what Dan was saying. That's what makes the calibration so important. The worst scenario you want to be in is you have an AI that's smarter than you, and it's very confidently wrong. And when you like look closely, you're like, hey AI, please tell me the truth, and it lies to you, and then you can't tell if it's actually telling you the truth or not. Right? That's like the worst case scenario. A better case scenario that's not great, that's not as good as the AI just doing the right thing, is the AI does the wrong thing, but it's like obviously wrong, and you look at it, you're like, I'm gonna redo it. Not the end of the world. That's the world we're in right now, where we're doing the thing. So definitely, we think AGI. Well, I personally think that on the AGI topic, we will enter like an intermediate stage where you have the AI doing a lot of stuff, but the human plays a huge role as part of the process.
If there's one thing I've heard from model researchers over the last year, it's that we need more and better evals to support frontier model development. Given the release of HLE, what type of evals do you think we need in the future, and what are you hearing from the community are the most important evals to build right now?
Well, I don't think they know what they want necessarily. They'd want something hard. But if they could articulate it really well, then maybe they just directly build it. Mm-hmm. That's sort of where the challenge in making benchmarks partly comes from. It is thinking where will what paradigm is next, or where will the main action be happening, and sort of setting up something that can capture that to track it and communicate that easily to other people. Otherwise, it becomes sheerly or much more closely just vibes based, because they can't articulate what makes them think that one thing is better than the other. So that said, there are some words thrown around for what things would make evaluations better. Or important additional dimensions to compete on or to measure, such as what's its ability to do open-ended tasks, which we're working on, or, and I think that relates to what's its ability to perform tasks over longer context or longer context benchmarks. So I think those will be important, useful things to track as well. But I think also people want these being more and more meaningful. I think generally people, when they're making these evaluations, they sort of just look at the meaningfulness of the benchmarks around and do something similar, like common sense. This is kind of fake in many ways. Like, this doesn't, thanks, you're telling me something everybody knows, this isn't useful. But that was still useful for tracking progress. And so when we were releasing MMLU, people were, this is way too difficult, what are you doing? But it's like, no, this is actually meaningful because this is the direction that it's going to go. And right now with HLE, we're seeing the edge of something that's very meaningful for the academy and for a lot of the sciences, but not necessarily for the economy at large. And with our later work, then it will be more meaningful because it will directly look at economic impact. So I think that's a next frontier.
Some of the challenges Dan listed with open-ended tasks or goal-oriented tasks, or even just evaluating long context windows. These are persistent challenges in LLM evaluation. Do you feel Scale is uniquely positioned to handle some of these challenges?
Well, I think if we're looking at super domain-specific, like open-ended tasks, it requires like expertise from a particular area. And Scale in particular, we are really good at getting a lot of experts in the room, in the virtual room on the other side, to come and contribute to this. So the answer is definitely yes. I think to add to what Dan was saying about the future evals, something we are really excited about is along the same line of evaluating agents in a more practical sense. We're also excited to look into more like enterprise use cases and evaluating model and LM agents on these very practical use cases, because there's a big gap between what we're doing here with like the labs, like the frontier model builders, and how much AI is actually deployed in the real world where most of the important economic activities are happening. So I think being the bridge of, so Scale, we have the frontier labs collaborations. We also have this big enterprise arm where we work with big enterprises and learning about their needs. We fine-tune models, set up agents for them, and really becoming the bridge of enabling these frontier AIs to be applied in these useful domains. That's something we're super excited about.
Well, thank you both. This has been a really interesting discussion. Congratulations on the release of Humanity's Last Exam, and I think we're all really excited to see where we go from here.
Awesome, thank you.
Great, thank you.